Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Simplifying Sustainability. I'm Anubha Bathla, founder of Neti. Today, we are talking about something I deeply care about, India's sustainability story. We hear a lot of global narratives, but our challenges, our culture, our solutions, they're nothing like the West. And who better to explore this with than Lieutenant Colonel Ashok Chaudhury, Army veteran, corporate leader, and someone who has understood sustainability from the ground. Sir, thank you for joining us again. Let's start with the big idea. When people say India's sustainability journey is different, what does that mean to you in simple terms?
Thanks, Anubha. India's sustainability journey is different because it starts with justice and coexistence, not guilt and restriction. We are a country still fighting poverty, still building basic infrastructure, and yet we are asked to contribute to solving a crisis largely created by others over the last 150 years. So, India talks about this principle called common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. That is CBDRRC. It sounds technical, but it simply means everyone has to act on climate change, just not in the same way or at the same pace, because our histories and capacities are different. India keeps insisting that climate action must allow room for development and must recognize historical responsibility.
That is an interesting framing. It's not about saying no to growth, but asking about how do we grow more fairly. So, could you talk more about this balance between development and sustainability for India? How does it show up in the decisions we take?
India's policymakers are constantly walking a tightrope. On one side, there is pressure to cut emissions. On the other, there is a moral and practical obligation to provide energy, jobs, housing, and basic services to millions who still lack them. That's why India often talks about the right to development along with climate responsibility. You see, in this way, India sets its targets. Instead of promising to shrink the economy, India commits to reducing emissions intensity, emissions per unit of GDP, by 45% by 2030 compared to 2005. At the same time, it is increasing the share of non fossil fuel power capacity to about half of total installed capacity by 2030. Analysis even suggests India may exceed this intensity target, which shows that growth and decarbonization are being pursued together, but not one after the other.
So, it is like India is saying we will grow, but we will do it in a way that gets cleaner every year. That is very different story from countries that grew first and are now asking everyone to cut back equally. Sir, emissions targets and policies can feel abstract. Can you help us understand what makes India's approach on the ground feel different from, let's say, a European country?
Absolutely. Take per capita emissions as a starting point. In absolute terms, India is a large emitter. But when you divide by population, the emissions per person are still way below those of most developed countries and even below the global average. That changes what is fair to expect from India. On the ground, India's transition is not just about fancy technologies. It's about things like distributed renewables, energy efficiency, and resilient infrastructure in villages, small towns, and informal settlements. You will find solar pumps for farmers, microgrids in remote areas, energy efficient appliances, and public transport being pushed in cities. These solutions are designed to meet development needs first and then climate goals, not the other way around.
India is also very vocal about climate justice and just transitions at global forums. How does that connect back to our unique sustainability journey?
Well, you see, India keeps reminding the world that just transitions must be just, meaning you cannot design a global energy transition that ignores equity. When India negotiates, it talks about climate justice, CBDRRC, and the need for policy space so that developing countries can define their own sustainable development pathways. This shows up in India's insistence on climate finance and technology transfer. Developed countries had committed to mobilize billions of dollars annually for developing nations. And India keeps pushing for this to be predictable and fair, not just promises. The message is clear. If you want the global south to make a faster, cleaner transition, you must support it with funds and technology and not just lectures.
So that would mean that India is not just negotiating for itself, but it is also speaking as a voice for many developing countries who are facing similar challenges. Now, I want to move on to something very close to our everyday lives. Sir, how does India's idea of sustainability show up in lifestyle and culture, not just in policies and negotiations?
This is where India is doing something very interesting with Mission Life, lifestyle for environment. That's how we say LIFE. The idea is to turn climate action into a mass movement by encouraging simple, environment friendly choices in daily life. Saving energy, reducing waste, choosing sustainable products, and so on. It's about nudging individuals first, then influencing markets, and eventually shaping our policy. What makes it uniquely Indian is that it builds on our traditional practices. Things like climate sensitive architecture, frugal use of resources, repairing instead of recycling, or community based water management. India is the first country to formally put lifestyle change like life, as I said earlier, lifestyle for environment into its climatic commitments, which tells you that our sustainable story is as much about culture and behavior as it is about technology and infrastructure.
It means that sustainability is not an imported idea. It is something we can rediscover in our own homes, habits, and communities. You often talk about how community driven and local our solutions need to be. But could you also share a few examples that show this local problems, local models, idea in action?
In India, a one size fits all sustainability model simply doesn't work. The issues in a coastal village, a Himalayan town, a dense urban slum are completely different. So, the solutions have to be designed locally. You see, communities managing common water bodies, panchayats pushing for decentralized waste management, or local groups experimenting with small scale renewables and nature based solutions. Many of these initiatives never make the news, but they are powerful because they are rooted in local knowledge, culture, and constraints. That's why community led models, self help groups, and local governance structures become such important drivers of sustainability in India, often more effective than purely top down schemes.
And finally, I want to touch on one of my favorite themes, India's youth and the informal sector. So, what role do you see India's young population and informal workers playing in this different sustainability journey?
Youth and the informal sectors are like silent engines of India's transition. Young people are at the forefront of climate startups, innovation, digital solutions, and activism. They are pushing for cleaner transport, better air, and more responsible businesses. At the same time, informal workers from repair shops to recyclers and waste pickers are already running a kind of circular economy without always calling it that. When you continue this with India's push to present its development and climate model as a template for the global south, you get a very dynamic picture. It's not about copying Western paths, it's about showing that the digital public infrastructure, social inclusion, and climate conscious development, countries like India can chart their own course and even inspire others.
Sir, if you had to leave our listeners with one simple thought about India's sustainability journey, something they can remember the next time they hear global climate debates, what would it be?
Well, I'd say this: India's journey is not about choosing between development and sustainability. It is about insisting that development itself must be sustainable and fair. If we get that right, with justice, community, and smart innovation, India can show the world a very different, very hopeful way forward.
Thank you so much, sir, for bringing this to life with such clarity. To everyone listening, India's sustainability journey is not about copying what worked in the West. It is about owning our context, our constraints, and our strengths, and redefining what progress means for us. This is Anubha, and you've been listening to Simplifying Sustainability. See you in the next episode.